Good morning. I'm Cora, the genealogy librarian on the fourth floor. You can come find me up there anytime. Before we start, I'd like to just do a little housekeeping. We have program evaluation forms in the back. This helps us to plan future programming. This is your library, and we want your voice to be heard on what you want to learn about, what kind of presenters you want to see, what kind of programs you'd like to participate in. And if you'd like to make a day of it, today at 2 o'clock in the same room, we'll be celebrating the life and music of Florence Price, an Arkansas native and the first African-American woman composer to have her work performed by a major orchestra. The university special collections will have a display featuring materials from the archive related to Price, and will also feature live performances by the faculty and staff from the U of A Department of Music, showcasing Price's compositions for piano and voice. So maybe head down to the Handshake restaurant that just opened, grab a bite to eat, come back up and hear some wonderful music. Also tomorrow we will be having the screening of the documentary Silas Hunt. It'll highlight the civil rights pioneer and first African-American student admitted to the University of Arkansas Law School. That'll be tomorrow here in this room at 2 p.m. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Trisha Mays-Cummings is a family historian and genealogist, a sixth-generation Arkansan, and has conducted extensive research on her own family lines, including that of her 3 times great-grandfather, Robert Hatchett, a formerly enslaved Baptist minister. Trisha is the content creator of her family history blog and podcast, Journey Through the Generations. She utilizes these platforms to share the story of her research and her ancestors, offering tips to beginners and sharing the latest developments in the genealogy world. Trisha is a member of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage Lineage Society, the Arkansas Genealogical Society, and the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority. Trisha is a graduate of the University of Arkansas with a Bachelor of Science degree and works at the Pat Walker Health Center on the University of Arkansas campus. We're so excited to have her. So please welcome Trisha.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Trisha Mays-Cummings. I'm a family historian, a genealogy blogger, podcast host, and sixth-generation Arkansan. I'm so excited to be with you all as a part of the Fayetteville Library's Black History Month celebration today. I have been attending Black History Month programs my entire life. So to actually be a part of one today is truly a full circle moment that I'm so excited about. You have no idea, for real. I've been researching my family for over 15 years now. What started out as someone who was just curious about my family history led to me going to libraries, researching records, and talking with relatives, and talking to relatives, and talking to relatives. These research strategies are what helped me discover my 3 times great-grandfather, who was enslaved in Jackson County, Arkansas, along with his emancipation papers that was documented in the Arkansas True Democrat in 1862. Genealogy for me is not just about finding names and dates. It's about recovering stories, restoring connections, and understanding how our history has shaped our lives. Today's presentation will walk you through how to build a strong history foundation, explain why African American genealogy can be challenging, and of course I will share some research strategies and records that will help you in your African American genealogy. Today's presentation does follow the best genealogical standard by starting with modern day records and working our way backward through time into enslavement records. Before we talk about how to research, it's important for us to understand why African American genealogy is uniquely challenging. These challenges are not due to a lack of our history. Our history is rich. The result is from America's complicated past. As we know, slavery was legal here in the United States from 1619 to 1865. During slavery, enslaved people were considered property, not as human beings, which led to their names not being documented and their stories not being told for over 246 years. During the Civil War, many courthouses were burned, resulting in widespread record loss. And during Reconstruction, while it brought the hope of freedom and liberty, many formerly enslaved people decided to start fresh with a new name in honor of their newfound independence. Later in our country's history, the Great Migration caused millions of African Americans to move from the South to the North and to the West, which sometimes caused the same person to be on multiple census records in the same year. We also want to know and understand some historical terminology. This is essential when researching African American genealogy. This helps the researcher correctly identify their ancestors in records and interpret their legal status throughout their lifetime. These terms often appear in records that you will be researching: census records, pension files, military records, and court records from the 18th and 19th centuries. These terms are such as enslaved, the person who was legally held as property; the enslaver, the person that claimed ownership of a person. A free person of color was not an enslaved person before the Civil War, but their rights were restricted depending on the states that they lived in. These next two, I used to always get confused. Emancipated was a formerly enslaved person who gained their freedom through a legal action. And manumitted was a formerly enslaved person who was freed by their enslaver. We also want to know some identifying terms as well that you will find in records, such as Negro, mulatto, colored, Afro-American, African-American, and Black. Now that we understand why African American genealogy is challenging, the next question is, how do we research? In the beginning, African American genealogy starts out much like any other family history research. You want to start with yourself, you want to talk with your relatives, go through what I like to call your family archive, and then you want to build a strong family tree. Every family history starts with you. Who knows you better than you do? You want to document what you know about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, your parents' names, your grandparents' names. And then you want to get those documents that corroborate that information. I know this sounds basic, you're researching yourself, but this sets the stage for the rest of your research. And if you were to ever pass this information down to anyone or donate it to a library or a repository, you want to make sure your information is not only included, but is correct as well. One of the most important steps is talking with our relatives. And I know my family is sick of me talking to them, but I still do. And especially our oldest living relatives. We want to make sure that we're touching base with them. But let's not forget about our siblings, our cousins, and extended family, because everybody remembers details differently. You know, we all went to the same family reunion, but my cousins sometimes have a different story than I had at that same family reunion. So you want to make sure you're documenting all of your information, talking to your relatives. And next you want to go explore what I like to call your family archive. These are items like photos, funeral programs, baby books, letters, and diaries. These are often items that are tucked away under beds, at the top of closets, in attics, sometimes in boxes in garages, like at my house. But these items, they also offer context to your family that you will never find in an official record. Once you've gathered the information about yourself, your relatives, you've gone through your family archive, the next thing you want to do is start actually building your family tree. Now, whether you use a genealogy software program, you go online like a website like Ancestry, or you use good old pen and paper like I did, the goal is going to be the same. You want to build your family tree, and so you can see what you still need to learn. This helps you see the gaps and the inconsistencies in your research. They will also give you some unanswered questions so you can go further in your research. For me, those gaps led to questions like, who were Grandpa Booker's parents? Or where was my 3 times great-grandfather born? When you identify questions in this way, that focuses your research to one particular family or person, and it helps you decide what record sets would be best in your genealogy. So now that we have a strong research foundation, we want to get to some records. We're going to talk about today's subject, African American family history research strategies, for some common and not so common records and resources. And the most common resource is the U.S. Census. I think we've all heard of or seen the U.S. Census in this room. The U.S. Census is taken every 10 years, and it started in 1790. Only free people of color from 1790 to 1860 were included in the U.S. Census. All other enslaved people were not documented. The first U.S. Census that had all citizens, black and white, was the 1870 census. Of course, that's because that's the first one after emancipation. It's also important to note that the 1890 census was destroyed by a fire a long time ago and is no longer available. And when I say it's no longer available, I mean it's really no longer available. It's not in the library on microfilm, it's not online, it's not even at the National Archives. You will not be able to find it. So you will have to go from the 1900 census to the 1880 census because we don't have the other one. While you're reviewing census records, if you were to find your African American ancestor on that 1860 census or prior, that is very significant because that means that your ancestor was likely a free person of color, and that would shift your research strategies from someone of a person of color than an enslaved population. There are some schedules that are associated with the U.S. Census that I'm going to talk about today. The 1850 and the 1860 U.S. Census also had a slave schedule. Now, this seems promising, I understand, but it has its limitations because, again, we're talking 1850, 1860 census, so these enslaved people were not listed by name. They were actually listed under their enslavers' names, and they only had their age, their sex, and their color documented. So to be able to use these census schedules correctly, you would have already need to know who enslaved your ancestors at the time. So if you don't know that, just put that in the back of your mind, and when you know that information, you know where to go next. Now, the U.S. Census mortality schedule is a record that I think is underutilized. This record set people went out into the community the year before the census was taken, and they basically documented people who had passed away that year, 1849, 1859. And they documented their name, their sex, their age, where they were born, and how they died. And this is important because we're talking about the 1800s. There were no death certificates at this time. So this census mortality schedule really can be some of the only ways you can find a death record for your ancestor during the 1800s. And just like with all genealogy research, you want to start with your most recent 1950 census and work your way back through time, researching one relative or family group at a time. And this is actually an example of my family in the 1950 census. It's Jackson County. This is my father's family. He's actually not listed because he was born in 1951. So I have to wait until the 1960 census to see my parents' names. I'm not bitter, I kind of am, but I'll look at it when they release it in 6 more years. But as you can see, his father was listed, Booker Mays, as the head of household. His wife, my granny, Gladys, my uncle Leslie, their son, and their daughter are all in a family group And as you can see, you can find out their names, the relationship, that's to the head of household, their race, NEG, that would be Negro, their gender, age, and their place of birth, which could lead you to other records to find for these individuals. The next records that we're going to talk about is vital records. We're talking about birth, marriage, death records. You have to remember that African Americans were often born at home without a midwife or a doctor to fill out paperwork. They were married by ministers and did not have civil registrations that were taken to the courthouse, and often buried without a formal death certificate. It's also important to note that statewide registration for births and deaths didn't start until the 20th century. For example, here in Arkansas, they didn't start recording vital records until 1914. So when a birth certificate cannot be located, a researcher should expand the search of records that were created throughout their ancestors' life. These are records that could have been maintained by family, the community that they lived in, or the government. You want to think about it like, during my ancestor's life, what record would he have completed that would have his name, his date of birth, and his parents' records? Those are the type of records that we would be looking for as an alternative to a birth record. And the same thing goes for death certificates. If you can't find one, you should be looking for records that were completed at the end of the person's life or shortly after their death. We're talking about records from churches, funeral homes, government agencies, insurance policies, things of that nature. They would have the person's name, when and where they died, where they were buried or cremated, and usually have some kind of family relationships documented as well. And some of these alternatives, of course, when we talk about the government, Social Security, we all pay into Social Security. We all have a Social Security card. So there are indexes with our names and things of that nature. Before there were records, census records, vital records, people were writing down information in family Bibles. Do you know where your family Bible is? I personally don't know where mine is. I've been looking for it. I'm still looking for it. But you should ask your relatives, your oldest living relative, do we have a family Bible? Do you have it? Can I look at it? These are the type of things that we want to talk about when we're talking to our relatives. And just for some examples, I have a headstone of my uncle, Leslie, that gives his full name. This is a military headstone, so of course, it tells us that he was in the Air Force. He fought in the Vietnam War. This gives his birth and his death date. This right here is a marriage record. It's from the Freedmen's Bureau. I don't know if you can see it, but this section right there, that's my family. That is Peter Hatchett, my 2 times great-grandfather. It says his wife's name was Eveline Mudd, which is good information because it gives her maiden name, and a lot of records don't give women's maiden names. And this was in 1867, so this was 2 years after the emancipation, and it documents on here that they had been living together as a married couple for 5 years, and they have a 1-year-old son, Robert Hatchett, and this is from Jackson County. And then the next one over here is a delayed birth certificate. Like I talked about earlier, state registrations didn't start until the early 20th century. This is my grandmother, Gladys Denson Mays. Well, she was Denson at the time. She was born in 1913. And for whatever reason, in 1949, she decided she needed a birth certificate. So she went down to the courthouse and she took her uncle, Newman Denson, with her as proof if she was given the correct information. And you want to think about delayed birth certificates were very popular. They're not in the same record set as original birth certificates. So if you're looking for a delayed birth certificate, you have to look for a delayed birth certificate. There's a whole index upstairs, and it's Arkansas prior births of 1914, and that's exactly what this is. So people needed birth certificates, especially in the 1930s. We had a war that was going on. People wanted to say, I'm too old to be fighting in this war. I'm gonna go get a birth certificate so I don't have to go over there. And also Social Security started, and people wanted to say, I'm old enough, this is some money I could do. So delayed birth certificates are very prevalent, and that's something we should be looking for. Newspapers. I love newspapers. I'm gonna try not to talk about them very long. When we think about newspapers, it's important to think of them as the social media of the past. Before Facebook, Instagram, group text, the newspaper really was how people knew what was going on in their community. If you wanted to know who was visiting in town, who was out of town, who got married, who passed away, who had a baby, what was going on at the church, when it's school activities, you went to the newspaper. In my community, we got a newspaper in the morning and in the evening. We got two newspapers because the Democrat was the Democrat and the Gazette was the Gazette. And then we got our local newspaper. So newspapers really connected people and kept them informed long before the digital age. And African-American newspapers like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, they had readers and subscribers all over the country. They reported on national black news, civil rights, migration, military service. They really connected African Americans across the country. And at the same time, there were black newspapers locally as well. Here in Arkansas, there was the Arkansas State Press, which is near to dear to my heart because my granny worked for them. So I've gone through that newspaper a lot. Other ways newspapers are beneficial is that they often interviewed centenarians, formerly enslaved people who were still living in the community that they were enslaved in. And these interviews were firsthand accounts of their enslavement, how they became free, and their current family life. You can find newspapers several different places. You can find them as a paid subscription, such as Genealogy Bank or newspapers.com. The Library of Congress has online newspapers for free at Chronicling America. And of course, right here at your local library, they're on the microfilm, but they'll help you if you haven't used one in a while. These are some examples of my family and newspapers. Up at the top, this is my 3 times great-grandfather Robert Hatch's Emancipation Papers that was documented in the Arkansas True Democrat in 1862. Down at the bottom right here, this is a marriage license request in St. Louis by my great-grandfather Wayman Denson. And then this on the bottom right here, ex-slave, has died at 113 years old. That's my sister-in-law's family who also lived in Jackson County. She was enslaved in Jackson County. She was actually interviewed when she turned 100, 105, and 110. There's quite a few articles out there about her. And then the one at the top right over here, the left, that is really an example of what's going on in your city. It tells you that Mr. and Miss Gus Hatchett and family, for the holidays, they visited her mother, Nona Wright. That gives us 2 generations of names and a maiden name. It gives us our sister's name, and that they lived in Chicago. And then down at the bottom, it tells you that G.D. Mays, who was my grandmother, and Mr. Calhoun went to a meeting in Jonesboro, and they were teachers of mathematics. Now, newspapers are not records themselves, but they can give you clues and information to be able to lead you to the records that you need to find your ancestors. So in this case, I can go to St. Louis and look up Wayman Denson. This is from 1949, and see who his bride was, when they got married, so then I can go to records to find my family. Community records are some of my favorite records, because these are the records that tell you about your family's life. Were they into the arts? Were they musicians? Were they into politics? What did they do? This is what I like to call researching the dash. You know they were born and they died, but what did they do in between that time? Is that me? Oh, okay. I was like, I'm super excited today, aren't I? Because of segregation, African American communities relied heavily on their own institutions. such as churches, schools, civic organizations, hospitals, and historically Black colleges and universities. These really were the backbone of the community life in African American history. And some of these records, of course, I feel like I'm being repetitive. These are probably in your family archive. We're talking about family reunion programs, school records. Things like that are also the things that you want to ask about when we're talking to our relatives. Specifically church records, I just want to mention that they are not just about membership names and Sunday school records. Church anniversary program, for example, can give you information about the church history, the founding members, current and past pastors, who did what in the church, who was in the usher board, who was in the choir. They often had ads that would have pictures of their members that you would be able to see. And you also need to remember that churches for a long time led the community in Black history programs. And while they did talk about national Black history, their local Black history and the leaders in their community would have been celebrated and documented at that time. Historically Black colleges and universities, they provide a wealth of information about their students and faculty, but they were also always in the middle of a Black community. So the community and the families are also documented and maintained in their library. Special collections such as oral histories, manuscripts, personal papers, photographs, reunions, yearbooks. So an HBCU can give information about the school and the community. Family reunions have long been important in African American family history. Following the emancipation, reunions provided a way for formerly enslaved families to reconnect. And after the publication of one of my favorite books, Alex Haley's Roots, in 1976, Black families started organizing and attending their own family reunions, including my own. And the family reunion program that you get, or maybe the t-shirt that you get, sometimes those have information on it, where your family was from, how the reunion started, photographs, family history. And they also usually tell you who in your family gave them this information or who the family historian in the family was or is. Also, you think about local books that were written about your ancestral home and the region that your ancestors lived in, because you never know who's writing a book and who will be mentioned in a book. Sometimes they talk about families, church affiliations, businesses, organizations. They can give accounts of social activities and historical context in the book or an autobiography of a neighbor that may have written and said something about the family across the street. And that might have been your family. So you just never know. So you can always go to Google Books. And what I do is I have a Google Book alert for African American family history, Jackson County, Arkansas. And anytime a new book is written, I get an alert about it. But you can also go to libraries, of course, historical archives, state archives, and online collections. And as we know, the library is what brought us all here today. So libraries are often overlooked, but very important. Libraries often are the researcher's best friend. They bring together many opportunities and valuable sources in one place. They usually have a genealogy section or local history section, and it's supported by professional genealogists and local historians that have a wealth of knowledge that can guide you in your research. Libraries often also have free access, if you have a library card, to some paid subscriptions such as Ancestry, newspapers.com, and things like that. That's a lot, right? I'm not going too fast, am I? Okay. You would tell me? Okay. Okay. So those are the most common records and things that we know about. Next, we're going to go into Reconstruction. Reconstruction was from 1865 to 1877. This is the period that immediately followed the Civil War. Specifically, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau, was established by the War Department by an act of Congress in 1865. The Freedmen's Bureau was a federal government agency that was created to assist formerly enslaved people transition from enslavement to free people. Because we're thinking about enslaved people, they had been on the same plantation for most of their lives. Reading and writing was illegal, so most of them could not read and write. The Freedmen's Bureau established hospitals for African Americans, schools. They reviewed their labor contracts, which were usually for the person who enslaved them. So the Freedmen's Bureau was really created to make sure that formerly enslaved people were not being cheated and things of that nature. So these records would include bank records, they set up banks, labor contracts, marriage licenses, because of course they couldn't legally marry in slavery. So once they were free people, they had to go and determine how long they had been living together as man and wife and actually get a certificate. Because the Bureau worked at a local level, they oftentimes tied formerly enslaved people to a specific plantation and county. You can review Freedmen's Bureau records at freedmensbureau.com for free. You will just search by state and by last name. They're also available at Ancestry. That is a paid subscription. You can also find them at familysearch.org, which is free. But in addition to online sources, it's important to remember that this was a local government agency, and wherever your enslaved ancestor was enslaved would still have records of these individuals. So we're talking state archives, local libraries, and the local county clerk's office. For me, that would be Jackson County, Arkansas. And they may have indexes that are not online, because the further you go back in time to research, especially the 1800s, those are going to be the times where you actually aren't going to be able to find as much information online, and you actually have to go to that county, to that state archive, and talk to some people in there and say, hey, this is what I'm researching. Do you have any XYZ? Another record is the Southern Claim Commission record. This was established by the federal government after the Civil War to compensate Southern plantation owners that had property taken or destroyed during the Civil War. These claims or lawsuits, they required extensive testimony, and many times formerly enslaved people were called as witnesses. These sworn statements would include their names, their approximate ages, the names of the plantation that they were enslaved in, and often where people lived before and after the Civil War. Again, you can find these on Ancestry through a paid subscription at your local library. They're all housed at the National Archives, but your local offices where these lawsuits were originally filed would probably be the best place to get the entire record. The WPA slave narrative, that's a collection of interviews that was conducted in the 1930s. Formerly enslaved men and women across the United States were interviewed by federal government agencies about their memories during slavery. These collections preserved hundreds of life stories of the last generation of formerly enslaved people. Now, for the researcher, these narratives can offer clues about family connections and relationships, plantation names, and possible enslavers' names. These also included descriptions of their childhood and accounts of marriages, births, and deaths that happened during enslavement that we will never find anywhere else. Now, with these narratives, it's important that they do have some limitations. These interviews were conducted decades after emancipation, and many of these formerly enslaved people were elderly. They were often interviewed by white people who sometimes influenced how these questions were answered. But despite that, these still remain a rare window into the lived experience of slavery and the resilience of enslaved people. The Library of Congress has WPA narratives available online, along with the University of North Carolina's digital collection, your state archives, your local libraries, including right here upstairs. The Fayetteville Library has the Arkansas WPA, Slave Narratives. Any questions so far? I feel like I'm the only one talking. Okay. Well, Reconstruction records often help us identify if our ancestor was either enslaved or a free person of color. To move back further in time to find out definitively which one it was, we have to go back even to further records. And that leads us to enslavement era records. Now, this is my disclaimer. Enslavement era research really is the hardest and most emotional research a family historian will ever conduct. It is difficult to read a document that lists your ancestor, you finally see their name, but beside it is a dollar amount, because it's a time where enslaved people were considered property, often appearing in plantation inventory lists, wills, and estate records alongside the animals, furniture, and tools. As painful as these records can be to review, it's important that we remember that slavery, unfortunately, was a business, and businesses create records. And these are the type of records that are the most valuable when identifying, naming, and tracing enslaved ancestors. The thing to remember when you're doing enslavement research is to effectively use these records, you first have to know who enslaved your ancestor. So you have to first know, yes, my ancestor was enslaved, and the name of their enslaver. But beyond that, you also have to research the enslaver. So the person that has enslaved your family, you need to research that family group just like you would your own ancestor. And this is an example of my enslaved ancestor, Robert Hatchett. Obviously, I have researched him, and I know his date, when he was born, when he died. I know his mother's name, his children, who he married, and I know his migration pattern. But to effectively use the records of enslavement, I also need to know about his enslaver, William Henry Pickett, who in the most documents was W.H. Pickett. I know his parents, his spouse, they didn't have any children. I know his siblings, and I also know his migration. And that is important because enslaved people were documented through the records of people that held them in slavery. So all of these people, their records could have my ancestors' names documented in them. So when we're talking about documents, we're talking about probate will, probate records, estate division records, plantation inventory list, deed records, and tax records. So it's kind of like doing double work. Maybe that's why I'm so good at genealogy. I research everybody. But in order for me to find my ancestors, I need to know where they could have gone next. Because oftentimes the records of the people who held my ancestors in slavery is this research process. And we're going to go back to this record right here. So learning about the enslaver's family, their parents, spouse, children, is significant because the enslaved people, we're talking about property, were transferred or inherited throughout the enslaver's family. So if you're going through a will, wrong button. If you're going through Steptoe Pickett's will, he passed away in 1843, and his estate was divided amongst his children. And that's how Robert Hatchett ended up with William Henry Pickett. If I didn't know those names, reviewing his will still would have led me to nowhere. So that's why it's important that you have to know who enslaved your family and their family history as well. Now, enslavement records and enslavement research really could be an hour discussion on its own. So I just wanted to make sure that I gave you the beginnings of it, the basics, during this discussion today. And that's basically what I've just done. So we're going to go back to this. Next up, we're going to talk about free people of color. As I stated earlier, if you found your African American ancestor in the 1860 census or prior, they are likely a free person of color. And researching a free person of color is just slightly different than enslaved populations because free people of color were recognized as citizens. So they do have some records that have their own name listed in them. These same records, but they would be for themselves and not the enslaver. Probate records, wills, deeds. And you think about tax records. They started in 1776 when the nation started. They're gonna make sure we pay some taxes. So tax records are very important when researching during enslavement because sometimes those are the only records that they have because 1800s, late 1700s, we wasn't really doing much else but paying taxes. The thing to remember with free people of color is court document records. Those are very useful because oftentimes if an enslaver manumitted a slave, it was in their will, sometimes the family didn't agree with that. And they would go to the courthouse and they would file a lawsuit and try to ensure that that person was not free anymore. And these, of course, led to years of going back and forth between what the will said and what the family said the will should have said, and daddy really didn't want that, and you know how it goes. So that would give you years of records that you would be able to go through, and that would also include people in the community that they would talk to see if that really was what the enslaver wanted. And also, free people of color were often still tied to formerly enslaved people and connected to enslaved families. So copies of their manumission papers or their freeman papers are often kept in the county courthouses, or like my ancestor, it was documented in the newspaper. So while enslavement era research is definitely difficult for African American genealogy, it's also a part of the genealogy journey that shows you just how much strength and fortitude our ancestors had. I often tell people, if it wasn't for Robert Hatchett, who was enslaved, I would not be here, and I definitely would not be in Arkansas. But I like to think that Robert Hatchett is somewhere standing up tall and proud, knowing that his story matters, that his name is spoken often, and that he knows that his legacy lives on through the research that I'm doing. And finally, I want you all to know that no matter who you're researching, don't be afraid to ask for help. Genealogy in itself is difficult. It takes people years to be able to get one piece of information, but you don't have to be alone. You can use local librarians, historical societies. They have a wealth of knowledge and be a great partner in your research. You can also seek out one-on-one consultations. I myself have used the International African American Museum. They have online consultations. And also the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City does virtual consultations as well. And many of them specialize in African American genealogy. And sometimes all you need is a fresh set of eyes or someone who's up to date on all the new record databases that have been released to be able to break you through that barrier that you think that you have. African American family history takes patience. You have to be persistent when you're doing this research. The records are incomplete, but our story, our history, is not lost. This is not something that I do lightly. This truly really is my passion. This is how I honor my ancestors. I preserve our stories. I make sure the lives of my ancestors are remembered beyond the records. I hope today's presentation has given you, even if it's just one new strategy or research record that would help you with your research. But I also hope that I've given you some inspiration to know that you should keep searching, keep asking those questions, and trusting the process that your family story will continue to be discovered. I am incredibly thankful to the library and Ms. Boland for inviting me to speak today and providing a space where our history can be shared, learned, and valued. If you would like to continue following me on this research journey, you can follow me at Journey Through the Generations on my blog. I have a podcast, Instagram, Facebook, all of those things that the newspaper used to be. I'm there. Thank you all for being here. This has been a very wonderful experience. I'm so happy that I was invited here today, and thank you all for listening to my stories. Do we have any questions, comments? Yes, ma'am, in the red.
Do you know what's available upstairs for someone to start looking at family history?
Well, as you all know, I actually don't work at the library, but I know someone who does work at the library and who actually works in the genealogy section. I will say that Fayetteville Library, I'm grateful that I'm near a library with this much information because my family's not from this area. But the Fayetteville Library has information not only about all around Arkansas, but literally all around the country. So Ms. Boland's going to answer your question as soon as the mics start working. But even if you're not researching from Fayetteville, you will be able to find information to be able to help you with your research. Ms. Boland?
Yeah, is this on? We've been working diligently to offer a variety of things for all people in our genealogy collection upstairs. We have, I think the last count was 18,000 volumes. We have family histories, we have slave narratives, we have access to Ancestry.com. We're an affiliate library with Family Search.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That's recent development.
Okay, that's a good one.
So come upstairs and just have a look at what we have. It can be a little bit overwhelming, but there are 3 staff members in the genealogy department, and we'd be happy to help anybody find what they're looking for.
Yes. And like I said, they have more than just Arkansas family history. They have information from all over the country because my primary research is Arkansas, but I've been able to trace some of my ancestors to Tennessee, and I come right over here to the Fayetteville Library and I find Tennessee records, Mississippi records, Missouri records. I found a newspaper from California. So come on over to the library. I tell people all the time I'm at the library. Yes, ma'am.
Question about Native American ancestry and connection. Like one of my nieces did research on my father's side of the family and traced information back to like the Choctaw Nation and so I was curious if there are resources available to be able to trace.
There are resources available. That's Native Americans, that's not my ministry, but I do know that and you actually are in a really good area. Do you live here in Fayetteville? No. Okay. You're in a good area because Choctaw, the 5 tribes, a lot of them were in the Fort Smith, Oklahoma area. So I know Fort Smith Library, they have a ton of information on Native American ancestry and things like that, the Dawes records and all of that. And also in Oklahoma, I've been to the Tulsa Library and I know that they have a lot of Native American resources as well.
We have a whole Native American section, and we also have a Black American section, an American slave collection also. So you got to come up here and look at what we have. There's a lot of overlap, so you're correct in that. Yeah.
And are you familiar with Angela Walton Raji? She is from Fort Smith, and she has published, I know personally, I have 2 of her books, and she is of don't let me say the wrong tribe. She's of one of the 5 major tribes, and she has written 5 books on her research. So that is definitely something that Angela Walton, like she's not one of them though. Raji, and I believe it's Rajai. I knew he was gonna know. But yes, she has 5 books. She is from Fort Smith, and she helped the Fort Smith Library with all of their collection.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What was your most exciting item that you found in your research that just made you go, yes?
Well, I will tell you, they tell you that you're not supposed to scream in the library. I did. And it's actually, you saw it up here. It is this right here. I found this at the University of Arkansas Special Collections. Although I could have found it right here, I just happened to be at the university that day. This is my 3-time great-grandfather's emancipation papers. It actually has his name listed on there, and it says that he was from the Pickett plantation. So they gave me information about his enslaver. And when I say, because I was on the microfilm, and when I say, because this was before the nice ones that y'all have now, I had to go through the little roll, and I have been rolling. Because you know, I'm used to today's technology. You just click, and you can get to it, not on the microfilm. So I was just going, and I had been there about an hour, and I was like, now I know this says that this is the day. So I went through it again, and then I saw it, and I really did scream in the library. And I had my son and my mother with me. They were in a different room reading. And my son came and said, "You are too loud in the library." Because he was like 8 or 10 at the time. And I said, "But I found it, I found it." And I was super excited. So yes, that would be my most exciting. And no matter how long I research, I'm always going to go back to this, because they often tell us that you cannot find your African American ancestor. And in the back of my mind, that was always there when I was researching. And then to actually see his name, and he has an initial that's D. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. To see his full name, it was just priceless.
Have you been out to the land? Have you been able to find where this property?
Well, that is a very good question. My family is from Jackson County, Arkansas. This is where he was enslaved. This is where I grew up. And growing up, I had no idea that my enslaved ancestors lived, 10 minutes, 15 minutes from where I grew up. So in this research, I discovered that he was a Baptist minister. He had found a church in the nearby town from where I grew up. And so yes, the church is no longer there. It was destroyed in a tornado in the 80s. But yes, there's a cemetery still there that many of the hatchets have been buried there. I'm pretty sure he's buried there, but he didn't have a headstone. But yes, I have been to the land. I've walked it. I've touched the trees. I have listened as he whispered in my ear as I was walking there. It was a very powerful experience, and something that I wish I had known about earlier in my lifetime. Because again, I grew up in this town, I went to high school in this town, and I had no idea I had enslaved ancestors that were 10 minutes from my house. Yes, ma'am.
Reconcile or reconnect with any of your relatives that you did not grow up with?
Yes, it actually has. I have a blog that I talk about, and one of the things that I did was I had a whole year of going through funeral programs. I know that sounds morbid, but funeral programs are like my favorite thing ever. And I was going through those, and I saw a name of someone named, last name Denson. That's my grandmother's maiden name. And I said, and it's listed their grandchildren. And this funeral was in the 80s. So I said, I bet this person is probably still with us. So I went on to the Google, and I researched, and I found him, and he was living in California. This is my third cousin, Shelby Denson. And I reached out to him. I wrote him a letter, and I told him who I was and that his father and my grandmother were first cousins. And I've been doing this research, and I'd really like to connect with him. And he immediately wrote back. He used email this time instead of, the mail. But he emailed me back, and this was probably 2017, and we still stay in contact. We speak on the phone at least 3 times a year. He has given me quite a bit of information on the Denson line of my family, and I would have never found him if it hadn't been for those funeral programs that I was going through. So yes. Yes.
How do you manage your emotions emotionally as you are doing this work? Like, from a mental perspective?
It can be difficult. For me, I have always enjoyed history. You would think I was a history professor. I'm not. I read Alex Haley's Roots when I was 12 years old. And I read Alex Haley's autobiography to Malcolm X the next year when I was 13. So I've always enjoyed Black history. I've read slave narratives in high school and college. So the foundation of my love of history, especially Black history, is what amplified my research. So I say all that to say, I have researched enslavement and slavery almost my entire life. So for me, I can understand that two things can be true. It's a business, but it was also horrible. My family got through it, and so I have to tell the story. And that's how I have reconciled it. Because if I don't talk about enslavement and what my ancestors had to go through and what I have to go through to be able to find them, then that causes erasure of our history. And that's something that I don't want. So although it's hard, like I said, looking at wills and inventory lists, and it has my ancestor and then pigs and hogs and tools, that's not anything that I want to look at, but I also know it was a business, and I have to look at it that way to be able to get through some of the records. Does that help? Are you sure? Okay. Yes, I can, and I understand that two things can be true at the same time, yes. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I should have repeated it, I'm sorry.
Okay. Can you elaborate on why the funeral programs are important? I, as a researcher, know, but everybody else might not know because each culture kind of
Yes.
does those different.
Yes, the funeral program in the African American community is what newspaper obituaries were before they were documenting that we passed away. So unless you lived in a town with a Chicago Defender or a Pittsburgh Courier, 9 times out of 10 in the early 1900s, that death was not reported in the newspaper. So newspaper funeral programs became how we told about the obituary, and it's a piece of paper. I actually have some right here because, again, I collect them. They would have your information when you were born, obviously when you died, has family connections, your spouse, your parents, your children, your education, if you were in the military. The thing that I like the most about them is that they usually have pictures in them, the most recent ones, but also they have the service of the funeral. So if your family has a favorite song, like my family has a favorite song, if you review all the funeral programs from my family from the 60s to now, His Eyes on the Sparrow gonna be on that program. And that's a family connection. And that's something that a lot of people aren't aware of. And it can give you details of the family life and the ancestor that has passed away. It's really like a This Is Your Life book, in short. Did you have a question? Yes, ma'am.
I was just curious about, like, because you said that you're a lifelong researcher and you've always been a history buff, like, was there a particular inciting incident that brought you to research your own family?
I wouldn't say it was an incident per se. I was at home. This was 15 years ago, so my son was probably 8 or 9 at the time, and I was back in Newport, where I'm from, with him visiting my father, and my dad had pulled out some photos, and to tell me about, I don't know, somebody. And we were going through the photos, and my son asked about somebody in one of the photos. And I looked at my dad and was like, well, who was that? And, because these were older photos, like older than my dad. And I said, well, who's that? And my dad didn't know, and of course it wasn't written on the back. And children, in their simple voices, he looked at me and said, well, why do you don't know your family? And I said, well, I don't know. Maybe I should learn. And so that is really why I started the basics. I wanted to make sure that he knew, everything that I knew. So I wrote out everything I knew and put it in a tree. And then, of course, I caught the bug and I continued. And now he is not interested in anything that I'm doing. He helps me with my digital stuff and my podcast and things of that nature. So I meet him where he is. But that's really what happened. He asked me why I didn't know my family. And I thought I had failed him as a mother. And I said, well, I'm going to rectify that. And now I know all of this stuff about our family, and he doesn't really like listening. But as he gets older, he's more interested in different things when my research is concerned. So, yes.
Trisha, thank you so much.
Thank
This
you.
has been fabulous.
I hope you got a little bit of something, one little nugget that will help you get started or continue your research. And again, these are the places that you can find me. And I think we have a few minutes if you want to peruse, because these are the items that I actually is in my family archive that I pulled out for you to see today. So thank you, everybody, for being here.